Hello and welcome to another episode of Osgoode Community Chronicles, where we explore the rich history, vibrant events, and remarkable stories that make up the Osgoode ward and surrounding communities. In each episode, we dive deep into our local heritage, drawing from the meticulous records and research of our local historians and families. These invaluable resources allow us to bring you stories from the past, ensuring that the traditions that shaped our community are shared with future generations. Whether you're a lifelong resident like me, or a newcomer, join us as we tie our fascinating history to the present-day version of our beloved region of Osgoode and surrounding communities. I'm your host, Tracy Daviero. Officially, Happy New Year. I hope that 2025 brings you everything you want and so much more. I want to thank you for being here with me on this podcast ride. I still have loads of things to share with you. I'd love to hear from you too. Tell us what you want to learn more about and who your family is. I was chatting with Amanda Nixon Thompson last week, and she was telling me how much she liked the connections in each episode. Truth be told, that's my favorite part too. And she gave me a couple of notes about the Nixon family from the episodes she had listened to. I'll refer to those in future episodes. I love to hear from all of you and your comments about the episodes that we bring you. Thank you, Amanda, for the chat. In today's episode, we're talking ice storm. It was 27 years ago this week that the biggest ice storm in our history hit our area, and I want to share a little bit about it with you. We'll have our news and events calendar as usual. Our business segment talks about House of Lazarus and a little bit about life in the country. In our historical segment, we'll share Joe Banks's thoughts about the ice storm of 1998, or his words, I guess. Our Community Voices segment comes from Pat Drummond of Manotick, and our mental health moment comes from Larry Ellis talking about friendship. Let's get into it. Every week on the podcast, we'll share some of the local events that are taking place in the area. So many great people doing great things. Please be sure that you get out to support them. The ODRs all seem to be open again after that warm spell. Thank you so much to the volunteers who maintain these for the community. Time to get your skates sharpened. I'm not too sure about the ice on the Rideau yet. We saw a few shacks getting put out a couple of weeks ago, but surely after that warm spell, the ice probably still isn't safe to be on right now, right? Not sure. But be patient. Ice fishing season is on the way. The temperatures have definitely dropped, and so I think it's pretty close. We are looking forward to getting out for some ice fishing this year. Fingers crossed. On January 8th, Scribbling Seniors is starting up again, and it runs till February 26th on Wednesdays in Kempville. If you're looking to add some creative flair, join this group to write, create, socialize, and learn. On January 9th, the Osgoode Village Gardeners Club is meeting at the Osgoode Community Centre at 7 p.m. They'll be discussing their meeting plans and agenda for the coming year and collecting membership fees, which are $10 per year. Also on January 9th, the Greeley Gardeners Group is having their January general meeting at the Greeley Community Centre. And this month's speaker is Master Gardener Mary Shearman Reed, who's talking about vertical gardening, vines, and trailers. Tickets are available online for that event. And the Greeley Gardeners are also seeking members at large. So if you're interested in gardening in the Greeley area, get in touch with them. On January 10th, it's the deadline for the ATV Club survey. The ATV Club is looking at expanding the current ATV trail network, and they have an online survey to collect your feedback and opinion. It's online until January 10th, so just a couple days left. You can view the existing and proposed trails and maps that are available online as well. The trail already goes through our whole area, but the proposed expansion serves primarily to connect the trails in Ward 20, Osgoode, to the other trails in the OFATV Club and to improve access to the villages. On January 11th, the Osgoode Cars United Church is hosting their next community breakfast starting at 8 a.m. It's scrambled eggs, pancakes, sausages, baked beans, and more, and a free will donation is accepted. January 14th, Osgoode Outreach gets back underway with their first lunch of the year on the 14th. It's a group for independent adults age 55 plus from Osgoode and surrounding communities, and they meet weekly at the Legion in Osgoode at 10 a.m. They have activities, discussion groups, and a monthly lunch. This month it's lasagna and salad, and it's $10 per person. And don't forget our youth associations. Osgoode has their drop-in nights on Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, plus a host of other activities. The Greeley Youth Association has moved their drop-in nights to Mondays, and the Youth of Manotick Association has their drop-ins on Friday evenings. And that's our news and events segment for this week. This week's Business Spotlight, we'll talk a little bit about the House of Lazarus and all of the services that they offer the community, as well as a little look back at how the pioneer families used to get by in their everyday life. The House of Lazarus is a nonprofit organization that has a couple of locations, one of them in Mountain, that works with the community to ensure that people have the basics of life. There's a food bank, many outreach programs offering food, clothing, household goods, furniture, and housing supports. Their mission is to build community by fostering relationships and building connections between agencies, businesses, service groups, and those who need assistance. You can have a quick look at their website to discover the amazing, incredible number of programs that they put on. These include Back to Work program, a birthday club for children under 18. You can donate birthday supplies to that one. Christmas programs, community garden, which incidentally was started by Osgoode born and North Grenville resident Terry McAvoy. Terry grew up on Lion Street with us. A tax program, a crockpot cuisine for monthly food bank clients, dinner on the house, which is a weekly community meal, 2 drop-in centers, a green food monthly food box, handyman heroes, healing pathway, Heat for the holidays, Hope bags for the homeless, Linking hands, monthly lunch and learn, medical supplies, Neighbors helping neighbors, Operation Backpack, which is weekend meals and snacks for children. Donations are gratefully accepted for that program. And Project Warmth and a resource guide. It really is an incredible organization that is doing so much for the community. If you haven't heard of them, go to their website and check out what they do and get involved if you can. You can get involved by volunteering or donating. Now, let's go back to Audrey Renton for a little story of how our pioneer families lived back in the day. We have visions of them homesteading and never wanting for anything, really, but that's not always the case. A lot of households struggled a lot. So I want to share this writing by Audrey that's called What They Ate and What They Drank. Around the 1850s, when many of the first people settled on our roads, almost everything from soap to yeast had to be made at home. The women folk were very conservative and frugal. They seemed in many instances to dislike and be afraid of changes. They clung tightly to housekeeping methods they had learned in the old country, although many times they weren't adaptable in Canada because of the harsh climate and different living conditions. Although meat was very scarce, fish, wild fowl, and wild nuts were very plentiful, as is recorded in a letter to Scotland dated 1855, written by a newcomer to Osgoode Township. We're working very hard to clear our land so we can plant potatoes next year between the stumps, but right now we have a great supply of fresh fish daily from the river, besides lots of wild berries and fowl. For this we are truly thankful to God. Although the types of food were limited, there was sufficient and much more than most of them had ever had in the old country. For the first year or two, the prime factor was to survive in the desperately cold winter to which they were unfamiliar, and what went on in their heads was of far greater importance than the variety of foods that went into their stomachs. As the farmers prospered and money became available, more types of foods were obtainable through the local general stores, so the second and third generations did benefit greatly from the wise planning and hard labor of their parents and grandparents. When the 19th century drew to a close, fancy Sunday desserts were very popular, as this was the day when relatives dropped in after church for a visit. The following recipe was kindly given to Carr's Women's Institute by a descendant of an old Irish family who settled on the second line of Carps. Bake a large white layer cake. Whip a large bowl of cream and place out in the snow to cool. Sweeten the cream with lots and lots of sugar and spread between the layers of the cake. Then completely smother the whole of the cake in sweetened whipped cream. This scrumptious-sounding dessert would be most unpopular with the weight-conscious women of today, besides also breaking the budget, but never-ending supplies of milk and cream were among the few luxuries allotted to the early farmers, and this they derived from the fruits of their hard labor. The amount of tea the farmers and their families drank amazed some of the newcomers, and they wrote back to the old country in 1856. The people in this country are terrible tea drinkers. The man I am with last year spends about 60 pounds of tea every year. The green tea, which the settlers drank by the gallon, was made very strong. They left it actually boiling on the stove in the agate teapot, and drank it with lots of white sugar when it was available, although it is mentioned in a letter dated 1855 that maple sugar was the only sugar in most homes. Black tea was almost unheard of in our area until about 60 years ago. Everyone used green tea, available for $2 to $6 a pound. I think that's what that says, 2/6D a pound, and delivered by the Daily Tea Man, as he was popularly known in the area. One lady still living described his visits to her girlhood home. He came in the late summer or early fall by horse and cart. If he arrived in the forenoon, he ate lunch with the family and carried out his business. Sometimes he came later in the day towards supper time and remained with the family overnight, and his horse was fed, watered, and bedded down in the stable. The green tea he sold was packed in 25-pound lots in a lead foil-lined thin wooden chest, and this invariably ended up as a storage box for Father's Sunday hat. As soon as possible after the first log shelter was completed, the pioneers prepared and planted a kitchen garden which broadened the variety of fruits and vegetables for summer eating and winter storage. They were amazed and wrote back to the old country about all they could grow in the hot summer climate. Mary made a kind of garden, and she has about 4 bushels of watermelons and cucumbers. They are very fine to eat in a warm day. However, the wild berries were still almost the sole source of supply for winter preserves, and berry picking was often a highlight of the summer activities. An old-timer remembers going berry picking with his grandmother and tells about her noon-hour beverage. She put green tea in a sealer before they left the house in the morning and filled it up with well water. Arriving down the fields at the berry patch, she would lay the sealer on the rock in the sunshine until lunchtime, and then she drank the tea, as she called it. What this concoction tasted like, we will never know. I think it sounds an awful lot like sun tea. Bread was very necessary, and to make it often became a monumental task for the women folk. Men and women both walked for miles, carrying sacks of wheat on their backs to be ground into flour at the mills in Kempville and Richmond. But that only took care of part of the problem. Commercial yeast was not available for some years, and so had to be made at home by the women folk from a variety of ingredients. The pretty hop vines that were planted years ago by the pioneers are still to be found growing on many of the farm lanes and twined around sparsely limbed trees. After boiling the flowers of the hops, the liquid was saved in a bottle and used as a razor, yeast, for bread. To ensure a supply of yeast for the winter months, the hop flowers were dried and boiled up as required. Besides being functional, the vines added color and decoration to the drab log houses when they grew around veranda posts, and they also provided shade from the hot summer sunshine. Although salt-raising bread does not seem to have been very popular in this area, a lady on the Osgoode side remembers well her grandmother making it. Oh yes, my grandmother was of United Empire Loyalist stock, and she made empty-ins bread on special occasions, and as kids we loved it. Here is the recipe kindly given to Carr's Women's Institute. Put 2 large handfuls of bran and 1 teaspoonful of salt in a stone bowl or iron kettle and mix to a stiff paste with blood heat water, 180 degrees. Cover and leave in a warm place for several hours and then strain off the liquid. Pour the liquid into an iron kettle and add enough flour to form a stiff dough. Then place the kettle in a warm place until the dough almost doubles in bulk. Although the recipe is easy to follow, no doubt the failure rate caused the inexperienced cook a great deal of frustration. The major problem was the difficulty of retaining a steady heat long enough to raise the dough. That bread was made from ground wheat and not oats in our area surprised some of the Scottish immigrants, as stated in a letter to Scotland, dated October 1856. The regular food people takes here is flour, wheat flour, bread and pork and tea, without sugar and potatoes. The last nourishment of the day before retiring was the little bowl of oatmeal gruel, a popular carryover from Britain, where it had been known for centuries. It has been replaced by hot chocolate for the last few decades now, but here is the recipe for the nightcap that remained popular for so long in the farm homes on our roads. Heat the milk and pour into bowls. Sprinkle oatmeal on top and a pinch of nutmeg. Eat with a spoon or slurp from the basin. It's excellent either way, and a sure cure for all that ails you. Indeed, that is what they ate and what they drank. And that's our business spotlight for this week. This week's historical segment, we're talking about the ice storm of 1998. Now, I know you all have memories of this event, if you lived here at the time. It was the biggest ice storm in our history in our area, and it all began on January 6th. We ourselves had no power at our house for 13 days. I was about 6 months pregnant with Owen, and we lived like pioneers, I think. For this week, I just want to share the write-up that Joe Banks did in the Osgoode Village storybook about the ice storm, but I would love to hear your memories of how it was, how it affected you, the things you remember about the experience, and we'll talk about it again in future episodes. So we have Chapter 8, The Great Ice Storm of 1998. There are few recorded events in the history of Osgoode Village that can compare with the fallout of the Great Ice Storm of January 1998. All of the village and surrounding communities were without electricity for 8 days or more as a series of slow-moving ice storms swept across eastern Ontario and western Quebec, causing devastation to power lines. The storm had a greater effect on the village than a similar storm in the 40s. Back then, few homes had power, and when it did come, it didn't arrive until later in the war. Village residents, long ago reliant on the steady flow of electricity into their homes, watched in awe as trees cracked and splintered into their backyards. So serious had the ongoing effects of the storm become, a state of emergency had been declared by the township and region officials, putting the village on the national news, along with others in eastern Ontario and western Quebec. It began on the morning of Tuesday, January 6th. Osgoode villagers awoke to an ice-coated world that, while appearing serious enough, gave the initial impression it would be short-lived. Visibly, everything was encrusted in a quarter-inch of ice, more in some places. Early morning commuters making their way into work couldn't help but notice the icy roads. Power was out, but most of the village received some renewal of power around 1 p.m., but for just enough time to boil some water before the power was again lost. Osgoode Township Mayor Doug Thompson declared a state of emergency on January 8th at 9:05 a.m. It wasn't lifted until January 28th at 11 a.m., making Osgoode the first township to declare the state of emergency in eastern Ontario and the last to lift it. It was the first day of what would become a week to a month of powerless living in the village. As the days progressed and storm followed storm, ice built up on branches. Villagers lost sleep listening to the sound of snapping limbs from heavily laden trees. It was the latest in a year of bizarre weather for the village. Just that past summer, a microburst, which some believed was a tornado, had swept through the village. Digging her car from under the sheet of ice that smothered the village, villager Linda Cantley told Review reporter Steve Coleman that she was happy a tornado had blown through last summer. The 3 large trees the twister didn't get on her property when the weather was warmer would have been knocked down by the 68 millimeters of freezing rain that continued to shut down most of eastern Ontario more than a week after it stopped. While some people living in the area knew more bad weather was on the way, a lot of them didn't. Village resident Alan Edwards said the severity of the storm caught him completely by surprise. "Our house is frozen," he told the Review January 10th. "We lost all our food. There's nothing." For Edwards, like a lot of residents, the biggest concern was leaving home. With 2 dogs in the house, he said the last weekend he was worried about leaving them on their own. He was also worried about leaving his house empty in case someone used the opportunity to break in and help themselves to his property. It was a common worry. But the most serious implication of no power was experienced by the farmers in the immediate vicinity of the village. With the electricity out at Alt Foods in Winchester, farmers had to dump milk rather than having it spoil in holding tanks. Tony Shriver, a farmer with 45 head of cattle near the village, told the Review that he had to dump his milk on January 10th, as it should be after 3 days in storage. Shriver was at the Metcalfe Hall, hoping someone would be able to give him some indication of whether or not a generator might become available temporarily. January 13th, they tried to milk by hand, but cows used to a pumping system don't take kindly to cold hands. Indeed, portable generators to power milkers became a hot commodity. At the farm, it was pretty serious, recalled area farmer and senior citizen Ross Taylor in a 2005 interview. The first few days, Brent, his son, had to borrow a generator after the owner was through with it. He would go 10 miles, get the generator, get his things done, and return at about 11 at night, go into a cold house and have bread and peanut butter. A few days of that, and he found a generator and with the neighbor helped their farm. The Osgoode Village Community Center became a 24-hour evacuation center with drinking water, cots, food, and warmth available. While a handful of people came through the doors of the center the first night looking for a sandwich and a coffee, volunteers would eventually serve hundreds of meals before the crisis ended. Manotick Messenger Derek Puddicombe reported the following in the local paper's January 21st issue. The doors opened January 8th for people to collect water. The next day, the center had a generator and 25 cots were set up for people to sleep. At the peak of the crisis, 18 people stayed overnight. For several days, volunteers depended on the Metcalfe Fire Station for supplies, but by late in the second week of the storm, the center was self-sufficient. The outpouring of volunteers has been unbelievable, said Relief Coordinator Sue Harrington, flipping through a duotang with about a dozen pages filled with names of volunteers, phone numbers, and the names of people who walked through the doors with food. Osgoode restaurants, Main Street Cafe, and Aussies came through donating food and their kitchens to cook food. Harrington said Osgoode didn't need a storm to prove that residents care about each other. This is the best darn community in the world, she said. Donations to the kitchen in the early stages of setting up the shelter included several boxes of large styrofoam cups and a firewood donation from the community. January 14th and 15th, the center served about 600 meals each night. Supper accounted for about half of the people fed every day. Gail Freeburn, the center's kitchen coordinator, told the Manotick Review that volunteers arrived from Aylmer, Nepean, Ottawa, and Canada. Cedarview Alliance Church in Barrhaven had been bringing 10 to 15 casseroles a night. Resident Laura Porteous was among the village residents who were grateful to take up residence in the community center. It had an unfortunate ending. We had to get out of the house, and I had a dog, and someone took the dog, and we had to live at the community center, she said in a 2005 interview. We had different beds, and we had our meals down there, and we were very thankful, but I lost my dog in the storm. In the village, a core group of volunteers donated time and energy towards making sure things were running smoothly. The Review reported January 21st that they've actually had to threaten each other to go home and get some sleep, Harrington said. Public health nurses stationed at the shelters also had done a good job of making sure people stayed in good shape. The Ottawa-Carleton Region's Health Department had inspected any questionable food that had been donated to emergency shelters during the 2-week crisis. But the center also served as a central oasis for hydro, military, and communication workers who were circulating through the region. Volunteer amateur radio operators working with the Canadian Red Cross stayed on the road, keeping people in touch. Canada resident Al McPhee, during a break at the community center, had been driving the loop from Cumberland to Perth, listening to radio repeaters for requests from farmers, for requests for fuel and feed. He was one of 2 Red Cross workers, dropping off a supply of coffee for volunteers and people coming to the shelter for food or drinking water. Businesses added to the relief effort, staying open to help residents cope. Beverages Your Independent Grocer was open in daylight hours with available stock on hand and had lots of non-perishable goods in stock. The Osgoode Scotiabank was open daily from 1 to 2 p.m. for emergency cash. The Main Street Cafe was putting its generator to use and supplying soup, pizza, lasagna, and more to the community center emergency shelter. The business had a gas stove and were making it available to people to cook their own food. They were offering their full line of food services and were open to 9 p.m. Power outage affected everything, including the village's most vulnerable citizens, its elderly. The Osgoode Care Center on Snake Island Road between the village of Metcalfe had a 2,000-watt generator to help them get through the emergency. Power first went off at the facility January 8th. A call to the Metcalfe Fire Hall, where relief organizers were based, brought out a small detachment of soldiers with B Squadron of the Royal Canadian Dragoons in a few minutes. The standby generator on site kept between 40 and 70% of the building running until the generator on loan could be wired into the system. Care Center Administrator Marie Monroe reported in a letter to the editor to local newspapers published February 4th. On Friday afternoon of January 9th, I called the emergency phone service for fire department support in the region and briefly explained some of our problems and was advised somebody would call back shortly. Contrary to my expectations of having to wait a considerable period due to the magnitude of the disaster, within minutes I received a call advising someone would be attending from the local fire department. I no sooner hung up the phone than there were 2 fire officials presenting themselves at our premises advising that they were there to ascertain our problems and needs. After our discussions concluded, within a very short period of time, 3 members of our armed forces arrived along with extra blankets and disposable dishes, and by early night a large generator was connected to our main electrical service, and essentially we were 100% operational. It is worth noting that the facility is equipped with a standby generator, but it's not adequate to operate all building systems. The disaster ended for our residents that night, and I feel it's safe to say that they never felt the wrath of the disaster or sensed its magnitude. 4 days after the first lights in the village went out, the military moved in. The township received aid from about 150 soldiers as part of the largest military mobilization in Canada since the Korean War. The soldiers rolled into the township and set up a command post at the Metcalfe Community Centre. Major Bernie Darrable from Camp Petawawa headed up the Osgoode military contingent. His orders were to minimize any danger from fallen branches and clean up homeowners' yards. This had been the second time in a year that the Major was able to help Canadian citizens. The previous spring he was a part of about 3,500 soldiers who were expedited to Winnipeg to fight what was then Canada's most devastating natural disaster. This presence meant villagers would become accustomed for at least 2 weeks to seeing military vehicles along with an increased police presence driving up and down the streets, resembling a scene out of a war zone rather than the quiet village its residents had known for so many years. And while it was reported that pockets of the village had power on this date, it was expected 1 more day, to January 15th, would be needed before full power would be restored. Ontario Premier Mike Harris had arrived January 11th at the Metcalfe Fire Hall. He met with Township Mayor Doug Thompson, who implored him to devote more resources to the emergency. Thompson made his plea for support to regional officials about the desperate situation in the township and directly to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien when he toured the rural areas on January 10th. I'm surprised how well everybody in the rural areas have been pulling together in a time of crisis, Chrétien said. The mayor himself, despite working long hours into the evenings, kept his sense of humor amid the crisis. Candlelight dinners have lost a little of their romance in the rural areas, he wrote in his weekly column near the end of the crisis. Meanwhile, Osgoode villagers coped as best they could. Innovation was the order of the day. Laura Porteous found a way to make a cup of tea. We piled some books and put a candle up the middle. The books were far enough away they didn't catch fire. I put a pie plate on top of that and put water in it, and by golly, it boiled for me, and I had a nice cup of tea that afternoon. So I thought if I can make tea, then I can heat a can of soup. Generators, food, and accommodation were shared between neighbors. Scores of villagers rushed to the community center with groceries. Teenagers loaded water at the front door with the precision of a well-trained team. Children played in the hall upstairs, a sea of toys around them, brought in by those insisting to join in the sharing. My own, this is Joe Banks's house on Wild Cherry, at the east end of the village, was among the lucky ones. It remained cold and dark up until Tuesday, January 13th, when power was restored to the subdivision, which has the benefit of buried services. The sugar bush behind on Second Line Road, just south of the Main Street intersection, resembles tangles of sharpened pike poles, bare on the ends. Poplars were bent over like rainbows, still encased in ice. Down the road, 10 poles had been sheared off by the relentless power of the ice. Trees exploded with a ferocity that sounded like gunshots. The trees in the village's Joella Park was the worst municipally owned property devastated. Our family of 4 stayed in our powerless house for 3 days before our kind neighbors, the Ross family, who were well equipped with their wood stove, insisted we join them for an evening dinner. As the managing publisher of the local newspaper, I spent 2 or 3 days both seeing to my property and family, covering the storm, and coordinating coverage for the Manotick Messenger. The following day, we retreated from the village completely, packed up some suitcases, and moved to my cousin's house with their family of 4 on Clover Street in Ottawa. It was clear to me then that the suburban and urban residents had no idea of the kind of scale of emergency we and our fellow villagers were enduring. By Monday, January 12th, volunteers at the Osgoode Village Community Center had served more than 1,000 meals. Some residents stayed overnight where a generator was working, keeping the heat on. Ironically, that same day was the date village residents were to begin placing tags on their bags as a part of a new and controversial township waste initiative. Tag-a-Bag was delayed until January 26th due to the storm. It was delayed again until February 2nd when some residents still had no power. Councillor Dwayne Akers, who sought the postponement, said lost revenue should qualify as a disaster cost and would fall into the loss of revenue category in the township's budget. In spite of the scale of the emergency, there was thankfully only one report of a death in the midst of a power outage. One unidentified villager died of natural causes during the ice storm after heroic efforts by Gloucester and Osgoode firefighters to save the man. Messenger reporter Derek Putticombe described the details in the paper's January 28 issue. Mike McIntyre, 51, had been with the Gloucester Fire Station 2 in the village where he was helping out during the recovery of the ice storm when he heard a call on his radio of a man having breathing difficulty. He was only 2 blocks away when he decided to race to the scene. When McIntyre arrived at the home, he was met by Osgoode firefighter Don Lewis and Andrew Orchard, who was also a Level 2 trained paramedic. When they reached the man, he was in obvious distress, said McIntyre. He was breathing, sitting in a chair, but didn't have a pulse. We got him on the floor and started mouth-to-mouth right away. Soon a defibrillator kit arrived, a piece of equipment that shoots an electric shock to try and get the heart pumping again. The 3 worked on him for quite a while before the ambulance arrived and a military medic arrived on the scene. Unfortunately, the victim died, as McIntyre found out a few days later. Even once the power came back on, danger lurked as power surges burned out appliances. One Osgoode family, upon returning to their home, faced $3,000 to $4,000 in uninsurable damages to appliances and wiring in their home after switching on their power before Ontario Hydro had checked the connection to the house. Said the Messenger in its January 21st issue, unknown to them, after power to the village had been restored, the connection at Paul and Bay Stevens' house on Spruce Street had been damaged by ice at the height of the previous week's storm. The Stevens had taken all precautions by switching off the main breaker. But the night power was restored around them, they turned it back on without realizing the electricity entering their house was unsafe. There was only partial voltage coming into the house, said Bev. Every time we turned on a light, the smoke detector went off. A strange buzzing sound could be heard, and flames burst from outlets appliances were plugged into. The Stevens' stove, television set, and garage door opener burned before their eyes. The house's ceiling fans and light receptacles also blew. They immediately turned off the main breaker. The house was a fire hazard at this point. We called Hydro 3 times, but because of everything that was happening, they were very indecisive. The Stevens also approached Hydro linemen 2 days before the power was restored, drawing their attention to the low-hanging wire above the roof of her van. They promised her the line would be checked before power was activated, but it was not. All I know is I watched my TV burn and my garage door burn. Other dangers were regularly cited by the local papers and public authorities. They cautioned against people running their fireplaces constantly since power left. Indeed, chimney fires kept firefighters busy. Gas-powered generators and propane barbecues and heaters running inside homes prompted a spate of carbon monoxide poisonings and subsequent warnings. And of course there was the ice. When I came home, my driveway, I'm sure, there was 3 feet of ice on it, said Lois Gilliland in a 2005 interview. I had to get John Crump to come up with a front-end loader, and it took him a long time to clean it out. But to this day, residents will admit that the ice storm was not all bad. It brought villagers together in a way that had been lost from more innocent times, when there was more mutual reliance. We were well taken care of, recalled village senior citizen and Osgoode native Bessie Edgar in a 2005 interview. And people were bringing things into us. When there's trouble, everybody seems to pool together. Main Street resident Linda Finn had put out a pad of paper during this storm and power outage and made 2 columns, good and bad things about the ice storm. I just left it on the counter with a pen, and as the days went on, we just jotted down things that came to mind. However, at the end of the week without power, and our only coal-burning fireplace to keep us warm and cook our food, I was amazed to see that the good side was longer than the bad. Good things. No snowmobilers. Camp pots. Mum knows how to cook in the fireplace. We can survive without TV. Friends are fun. volunteer firefighters, helpful township, free firewood and water at the community center, Gail's soup and buns, living across the street from Pronto and being able to see the beer and bread trucks arrive, soccer socks. Sunsets are now visible from home and the kids learned how to play cribbage and remoli. Bad things. Cold toilet seats, can't flush. Waterbeds are cold in winter without electricity. No showers. Flipping light switches. Trying to walk outside. No school. The kids say this should be on the good side. Listening to trees go boom. Being short-tempered. And the vomit mobile. The bad side was about comfort, Linda later said. The good side was about family, friends, and helping one another, being a community. Indeed, the resilience of the village's residents showed up when organizers insisted on at least some of the events of the 31st Osgoode Winter Carnival make it out of the program book and into the village. The weekend of January 24th, the snowball tournament, and the wrap-up dance. The Order of Osgoode dinner, awards, and entertainment banquet was rescheduled for March 7th at the community center. It was announced that the state of emergency in the township officially ended on January 28th at 11 a.m. The community center stopped serving meals and providing a place for people to sleep January 19th, but remained open for emergency food supplies. The last 2 people living at the center went home January 18th. Later, it became a brush depot. Residents were asked to return all borrowed equipment to the fire halls or to the community center as soon as possible. In fact, on March 11th, the township fire department was still looking for 4 generators and a chainsaw. The entire emergency was costly for both property owners and local government. Osgoode Township asked for $800,000 for costs and damage it incurred as a result of the ice storm. However, the matter of compensation to the township and its residents would continue on for months. Former Osgoode Township Mayor Al Bowers represented Osgoode on a newly struck disaster relief committee that would eventually disperse $20 million to storm victims within the regional municipality of Ottawa-Carleton. And that is our historical segment for this week. Today's Community Voices comes from Manotick resident Pat Drummond's blog. Pat operated the Manotick Business Directory, and I worked with her at the Messenger in the late 80s. And I came across this blog of hers that is sort of a daily diary of what was happening at her home during the ice storm. During the ice storm of 1998, I kept a small diary each day of what was happening in our home near Manotick. Someday, I hope to read it and laugh. January 5th, 1998. We lost our power with the first ice storm that dropped 13 millimeters of record-setting rain, freezing rain, then ice pellets, the same as hail. By dawn, more than 24 millimeters of freezing rain had fallen, coating everything with 2 to 3 centimeters of ice. Although we regularly get freezing rain in the winter, we hadn't seen anything like this since Christmas 1986. The forecast said more was on the way. To start at the beginning. January 6th, another 10 millimeters of freezing drizzle to add to the 24 millimeters already down, with yet another storm from coming. David and Joan Davies had made plans to visit us. We met them in 1989 when we cruised south in our sailboat and had kept in touch. They had been working in Hungary since David's retirement. They drove up from Kingston to visit us as planned, not having heard the weather warnings about the ice storm. Power is out for 100,000 homes in Ottawa-Carleton as hydro lines snap under the weight of the ice, but no one outside the area seems to know anything about it. I suppose another storm doesn't make good news. They arrived on salted roads to see our trees hanging with the weight of thick ice coating everything. The power went again just after supper and lasted till the next day. We lit the fireplace again and talked by candlelight and went to bed under many extra blankets. We thought it was over. January 7th. The forecast is for another 28 millimeters of freezing rain. I don't see how the trees can take any more, never mind the roof. Later, it appears we actually got 38 millimeters. Again, we lost power just as we were finished cooking supper. Again, we lit the fire and candles as the drizzle continued. That night was constant explosions that was hard to sleep through. Each explosion was a large branch or tree coming down. It reminded me of movies of those whistling bombs in London during the war, with people waiting for them to hit. Around 3 a.m. I got up to check the basement and ended up repairing a leaky pipe from the sump pump with magic tape. Just to add to my humor, Skipper the cat threw up on the floor. No, I didn't step in it. Then one of the One of our largest backyard shade trees came down, roots and all. There must have been 10 centimeters of ice on all the trees. The door frame over the patio door started to leak from an ice dam just as I was surveying the downed tree. Even in the dark, I could see that we were in real trouble and power would be a long time returning. All wires in the countryside are carried on poles. Only the straightest trees and spruces survived the ice load. Everything else was coming down. David and Joan escaped in their car with wide eyes the next morning just before the third ice storm began. They didn't stop until they got past Toronto. Very smart to pass up visiting their daughter in Kingston, as they were hit there too. The skipper's 12-volt sump pump saved our basement with my car battery as charging unit. 20 hours of pumping from a 12-volt battery to pump out water of the basement is not bad, as it needed pumping every hour. We were using the fireplace to heat the house. January 8th. One of our neighbors closed up his house and left, and gave us his 2 kerosene heaters. Of course, you needed to be aggressive to buy any kerosene, as it was like liquid gold. You could not buy a heater or fuel or generator for any money. Ottawa Carleton has declared a state of emergency today. Pray help comes before the inevitable deep freeze. January is not a very good time to lose power. We can't even find out which main line our power comes from. Estimate between 2 hours and 2 weeks. January 9th. More freezing rain in the forecast. Hydro workers are not making much progress as many more lines go down as soon as they get one back up. We remembered that a good friend had a generator, but they were on holiday in Mexico. Things were looking serious by then, so we phoned his son, who broke into his parents' iced-up tool shed to get the generator for us. He picked up some kerosene that we had located and drove it all to us on his four-wheeler. Now we had enough power to run the sump pump and freezer too, warming up to -2 by then. When it got colder, we had to unplug the pump, set a timer alarm so we could run an electric heater for a short time. I made a chart of how many amps everything in our house needed, and we juggled the power to do only the important things, like make coffee in the morning. We didn't really need caffeine, but it made us feel normal to drink it. We were still cooking in the fireplace, but eating mostly cold food. January 10th. Today the sun came out and we could see the eerie combination of thick ice shining in the sunshine combined with the terrible destruction it had caused. Every tree in the area showed damage. We had the only whole tree on the ground, but many others won't survive the damage. Chrétien and Harris are touring the area as hundreds are now sleeping in emergency shelters. I had offered help to a neighbor to feed their cat. The first time I did this, the cat swatted at me, drew blood, and my hand is now swollen. I was coordinating a contest to design a new homepage for the National Capital Freenet. All the entrants and judges were working online. As soon as I had a few minutes where we didn't need to run the pumps or freezer, I got online and tried to catch up on this work using a small laptop. The skipper had been home for a few days, thanks to a kind boss, so the exhaustion was shared. January 11th. A friend dropped by with more kerosene on her way to visit her daughter, who has not had any power, water, or telephone, and had horses to feed and water. My problems seemed smaller. The skipper went shopping at the hardware store for the growing list of things we need. January 12th, 46 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees Celsius, on the thermometer this morning. Brr. I phoned Mom to let her know we are okay, but I wonder if we are. I ended up going to Ottawa. The local clinic was closed to discover my hand was infected from the scratch 2 days ago. Antibiotics and elevate the hand and rest. Joke, eh? So now the skipper had to do all the labor that required 2 hands. A neighbor was wiring everyone's generators up to their electrical distribution panel. Our house was the third to get wired up and the furnace wouldn't work, of course. January 13th. After a $200 repair bill for a new relay on our leased furnace with a service contract, we had an electrician wire a heavy extension cord into the furnace, for free. The generator ran the furnace for an hour and quit. Carrie arrived with the big 4-kilowatt Jenny about 20 minutes later and asked, "Are you Irish?" At last we are warm and dry without juggling cords. Ottawa's official emergency ended today. Workers from across Ontario are in the area and the military has been helping clear trees and dig wires out of the ice. There was a public meeting in Carr's Village, but the skipper decided to sleep instead. Someone must have impressed the guy from Ontario Hydro that there were 300 houses here with underground wiring near the Carr's line. That night, our subdivision was hooked up from Carr's. It took me less than 2 minutes to get the breakers on and the furnace going. Warmth. In an hour, I was having a hot shower. The skipper observed that daily showers are highly overrated. Power back. We got power back after 9 days, just before it went down to minus 20 degrees. Many thousands are still freezing in the dark. Back in the land of light and heat, you never know how dependent you are on power until it's gone. They say now we have stolen the record of the largest peacetime deployment of troops in Canada from Winnipeg. Folks out west are annoyed. Someone said that it was all a wake-up call. I responded that I had only learned one thing. I will never again live in a house with a sump hole in the basement floor. But for that, we could have winterized the house, emptied the freezer, packed Skipper Cat, and moved into the city, where some lost power for a few hours. The stress of trying to keep the basement from flooding, freezers from thawing, the house from freezing, and helping neighbors pump their basements was exhausting work that never seemed to end. The most amazing thing was that our newspaper arrived at our door even when the branches were raining down. I don't know how they did it. Our yard is a mess. We paid the neighbor's son and friend with the mighty chainsaws to clean it up, and the front of our yard is now about 5 feet high with branches stacked up from one side to the other. We also have lots of firewood, although I may not have another fire for a long, long time. There are many thousands still without power. We discovered that modern insurance policies don't cover any of the expenses we've had so far, except for the dent in the car from a falling limb. January 14th. Driving into town for a much-needed break in dinner, we saw just what a mess the wire and poles are in. There were workers and cherry pickers working on every second road. On the way home, we saw very few lights around the towns and villages. No lights between Manotick and our group of homes, and none beyond. Areas southwest of us toward Winchester are hardest hit in this area, with estimates of a month for power. They didn't even have phones south of us. Our friend who owns the generator we borrowed came back from Mexico with his wife, who had a broken wrist that still needed to be set. He immediately had to leave for Edmonton, minus 35 degrees Celsius, saying to the skipper, "We sure have a set of bookends." My mom in Rosetown, Saskatchewan was complaining about the very cold temperatures in the middle of all of this, and I said, "Yes, but your house is warm." It's all relative, I guess. I hope you feel warmer just reading this. January 23rd. It isn't over yet. Forecasting more freezing rain. Virtually yours, Pat Drummond. And a footnote. What made the ice storm so unusual, though, was that the freezing rain went on for so long. 6 days, 4.7 million Canadians without power in the middle of winter, most in Quebec and eastern Ontario. 100,000 people took refuge in shelters. There were at least 25 deaths, many from hypothermia. Freezing rain brought down millions of trees, 120,000 kilometers of power lines and telephone cables, 130 major transmission towers, and about 30,000 wooden utility poles. 14,000 troops were deployed. There were 792,514 insurance claims made, with $1.6 billion paid by insurers, and that's a record, according to an article from Environment Canada about the 1998 ice storm. And that is our Community Voices segment for this week. And for today's mental health moment, I wanted to finish with a little note, or I guess a little article from Larry Ellis from the Manotick Messenger in January 2018. It's titled, "Maybe the best New Year's resolution is to be a better friend." As we usher in the new year, the customs and traditions that January brings start to creep back into our daily lives. We will date out checks incorrectly, we may complain about how much weight we gained over the holidays, and we usually make resolutions that won't be kept. We have seen the passing of another year. There have been times when experiences and certain events brought us happiness, and we have laughed. For others, there has been pain and tears. Some of us have said goodbye to longtime friends or loved ones, and we have cried. If you are having trouble making resolutions for the new year, I have some thoughts that might help all of us be better people and might even cause some change in this mixed-up world as well. First, we can start by making a resolution to just be better friends. The only way to have a friend is to be one, and this means 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Ask yourself, when was the last time you really went out of your way to help a friend? When was the last time you spoke to or visited that elderly neighbor or the new family that just moved into your neighborhood? When was the last time you just told a friend how much they mean to you? Being a better friend won't cost you anything. It can be done every day, and the positive effects are immeasurable. Think of how much better this place could be if we just cared a little more and loved a little stronger each day. Don't let a little dispute injure a great friendship. Remember that each moment, each hour, each day is a chance along life's journey to keep these resolutions. Remember, we can make a change in the world around us. Remember to stand by one another during life's peaks and valleys. Offer a shoulder to lean on when life's load becomes a burden. Remember these 3 R's: respect for self, respect for others, and responsibility for your actions. Happy New Year. And that's from Larry Ellis. And I thought there were no better words to share with you at this time of year, but also because of the ice storm and how everybody did all of these things at that time, in the time of crisis. And that is our mental health moment for this week. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Osgoode Community Chronicles. I hope you enjoyed our connections from the past and our taste of the present. Remember, you can catch all of our past episodes on Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon, or anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can also listen online at our website, osgoodecommunitychronicles.com, and follow us on social media on Facebook and Instagram. Don't miss next week's episode, where we'll share more news and events in your area and more stories of families past and present. Also, be sure to look for links to all of the news, events, resources, and information that we provide on the podcast episodes on our website, where you can learn more about everything. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast on your player so we can be found by more people. We'd also love it if you'd leave us a review. It really helps others in the community find the show. Thank you again for supporting our snapshot of our local community. I'm Tracy Daviero, and this has been Osgoode Community Chronicles, keeping our rural spirit alive, one story at a time. See you next week.